Hello, everybody, and we are here for another first from the Alliance of Independent Authors. I'm here with Dalma from Publish Drive, and we are launching this evening our self-publishing poetry podcast. A first, as I said. We've always talked about self-publishing, of course, and included poetry in it. But this year, by year I mean the start of now, the academic year here in London, we always think of back to school as the start of our year. And this year we are splitting out self-publishing fiction, self-publishing poetry, self-publishing non-fiction, because of course there's lots that they share, but there's also lots that's different. And poetry in particular is having an amazing renaissance through self-publishing, and we're going to be talking about all of that. But first, let me introduce my brand new co-host for this program. It is Dalma. Hi, Dalma.
Hi, Orna. Thank you so much for including me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
It really is great to have you. And Dalma is in Hungary. I'm coming to you from London. And tell us a little bit about yourself, Dalma, for those who haven't met you before. I know that a number of our members have met you through your work for Publish Drive and maybe in other capacities as well. But just tell the good folks all about you.
Thanks, sure. My name is Dalma Szentpály, and I am working for Publish Drive, a self-publishing platform. It's amazing. If you're in the writer, you definitely have to check us out. We are basically a bunch of book nerds who really want to give the best opportunity to indie authors who want to explore the exciting times that is happening right now in publishing, because a lot of barriers are coming down, and we are just wanting to give you the best of a robust platform that you can explore and have your chances there. And aside from my work in publishing, why am I actually involved with poetry? So I'm a lifelong lover of the genre. It started when I was probably 6 years old, when I just finished basically kindergarten probably, and my mom started to read me poems. And here in Hungary, it's almost obligatory to learn poems and recite poems. You have a lot of poetry contests that you have to do. And my brother actually is a poet, so he was a great influence to what I should read. So not only Hungarian poets, but international ones. And in university, I wrote my thesis about poetry and a particular form of poetry. And now I try to give advice via Publish Drive's blog to self-publishing poets. And I did a very long post about it last year, and it just got me involved with Insta poetry, which is amazingly exciting what's happening there right now, and how a lot of readers are just starting to fall in love with poetry again, and classics are getting re-explored, like the Odyssey or Emily Dickinson. So not only new poets, new voices, but old voices are really interesting right now. And Orna, you're a poet as well. So what are you thinking about this new and exciting time that is coming into poetry?
Yeah, I am indeed. And it's kind of ironic. My very first self-publishing outing, well, digital self-publishing, I had done a print book some years ago, a consignment print, the old-fashioned way, the books in the garage kind of thing, for a women's group that I worked with them, which actually was quite successful as self-published books go. But my first digital self-publishing outing, before I got my rights back from my publisher, was actually a poetry pamphlet. And I learned my self-publishing craft and trade through poetry. And yet somehow I always had this kind of almost like a blind spot around it. You know, the way we talk in creative work very often about challenging your own assumptions and What you don't know is kind of what kills you. And I never really expected to sell my poetry, even though I was selling some pamphlets and having a very nice time and really loving the creative side of it. I didn't treat my publishing the same way as I treated my fiction and nonfiction. I have various sort of marketing things in place that I do automatically when I publish a new fiction or non-fiction book, but I wasn't doing that with poetry. So I didn't have a perma free, for example. I didn't really have a dedicated poetry list. I have my poetry people in with my fiction people. And about a year ago, I realized, why am I doing, I haven't really given even though I take it very seriously as an artist, as a creative, I haven't given it the same sort of commercial attention. And when it started with a conversation I had with Robin Ingram, who is the director of Ingram Spark. And she was the first person, talk about spark. She was the person who kind of lit the spark, because she said to me that her poets, as she described it, my poets are the best sellers on the platform. And
absolutely
blew me away. I was really surprised to hear that. And then I read your post and I thought it was fantastic. And then we had that great conversation at London Book Fair.
Yes.
Yeah. And we talked about, wouldn't it be great to have, and here we are doing it. But I started then to take my own poetry more seriously in the last 6 months to a year or so, and with really amazing results. And I find that people who like to buy poetry buy directly, much more from my own site. And generally, anyway, that's my kind of story as to how I came to be here. And then I realized ALLi doesn't have a poetry, how to self-publish poetry podcast. And there are big differences between,
how you approach it. How you
approach it, how you get out there, which platforms you use, all that kind of stuff. So I thought, no, this has to be fixed. So here we are. That's how all of that came about. Yeah. So, and talk a little bit about that post that you wrote, actually, because it really, and if you have the link, we'll put it in the show notes. I really do commend it to anybody who's listening and who isn't aware of what's going on in poetry at the moment. Fill us in.
To be honest, and I completely understand why you had this different approach to poetry, because I think we have this prejudice that poetry is not selling because it's an old form of literature, and what you have to learn in school, at least some of it, and you have in mind Byron and Shelley and all these very old stuffy guys, some of them. I'm not saying they're not good, but and I was very surprised when I started to look into it. So what's happening right now in poetry, for example, that poets are invited to late night shows at Jimmy Fallon and Jimmy Kimmel, and they are asked about why they are so successful. So some of these poets, for example, Rupi Kaur has 3.4 million followers on Instagram, which is, by any celebrity standards, a very, very high number. And the reason why it's such a different take on poetry right now is twofold. One of them is that people usually in uncertain political times, when there is a lot of change happening, are opened to poetry, which is and on a one level, it's very lyrical and very emotional and very empowering. So if you think about old revolutions, most of the time poets were actually the revolutionaries taking part in revolts. And that's one of the things why right now it's definitely a lot of political upheaval happening in every sort of Western or Eastern European country, or in America even. And the second part is that a lot of platforms, for example, Instagram, and the way we consume literature changed a lot. So digitalization actually is good for sharing poetry. It's instant. You get a very emotionally impactful text, which is very short, because poetry can be the shortest form of text in literature. And that's why it's very, very successful. So last year I did kind of an overview of what is happening right now and why is this change happening, as well as suggestions on the platforms that you can share your poetry and how you can experiment with form, as well as your techniques, what kind of themes are out there. So these sort of issues were mentioned in it. And just additionally, because this is a last year post, but nothing's changed. Actually, it's getting bigger and bigger. So according to Nielsen, last year about 12 million pounds were sold in poetry, and there were 12% growth in sales. So for 2 years now, it's just growing and growing and growing. So I encourage everyone who ever had any inclination to publish poetry that this is the time to do it. This is exactly the time to do it.
I think so. I couldn't agree more. And just to say that those figures through Nielsen would be probably UK based only. Does that take in the US as well? Do you know?
This only takes the UK, but in the US as well, there is an 8% or 9% growth as well from last year's figures. So I'm not exactly sure about the sales figures, but growth is not stopping. So it's a constant growth in sales figures. But I was not able to find from last year's any type of actual money. Yeah. How many volumes have been sold?
But it's definitely an indication of the growth, and of course, it's not taking in a huge number of indie poetry publications, because lots and lots of poets don't put an ISBN on their books. And in fact, some of the poets who are doing extremely well are not actually publishing poetry books at all. They're publishing individual poems and in different ways online and so on. And one of the things about this podcast is really to encourage poets to think about putting together collections. So be it themed collections or just selected poetry or whatever. Yeah. It's one of the things that we hope to do. And so, just to fill in people a little bit about what we will be doing on this podcast specifically, because it is poetry, it's going to be a little bit different to the others. So each month Dalma and I will take a theme. And so it might be something like that, putting together poetry chapbooks. It might be a form kind of thing, or it might be a particular type of poetry that's doing very well. So you mentioned Rupi Kaur earlier, and the Instagram poets. A lot of those poets write in the expressive poetry genre. So we might take a look, for example, at a specific genre or whatever. Here's Sasha actually in with a question on that. Hello from Greece. Been so excited to watch this podcast. I'm obsessed with Rupi Kaur style poetry. I think Orna called it expressionist. Yes, expressive. Expressive poetry is that particular genre. I write in inspirational poetry, which some people think of as Christian, but it's not at all. It's just poems that aim to be, to inspire. Motivational. Yeah, could be motivational. Could be, spiritual, that sort of end of things. Motivational is huge, isn't it? It's everywhere.
Absolutely.
Empowerment,
Absolutely.
Poetry around empowerment as well. So we're seeing all sorts of new kind of trends. We're also seeing new forms. Micro poetry is huge. Haiku is gone from being an obscure Japanese form to being everywhere. Everyone's writing haiku.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to share a little bit of an anecdote about that. I was spending a little bit of summertime with my friends, and actually 2 days ago, I was still with them having a vacation, a mini vacation. And what we do together usually is write haikus together as a group. So it's not only, a form of literature that is only for writers, professional writers, but this is something that friends can explore together. So, it's just everywhere. Literature can be everywhere. And it can be fun. It can be serious, of course, but it's definitely a communal thing. And poetry, especially right now, is very communal. So it's not a solitary or solitary expression, but you have a voice that you are using constantly for having a dialogue with your readers. And I think that's definitely something that's for the 21st century, where you're in constant dialogue with whoever you're writing to.
Exactly. And it can be, just to say there, for those who are wondering what haiku is, just got a private message on that. It's a short, it's very stylistically formal poem that normally often based in nature, but that really kind of tries to capture a creative moment. And you can follow on Instagram on the hashtag creative moments or on the hashtag haiku. And see other people, what they are doing with form. And it really is very interesting. It was, the Japanese poets did it traditionally with very strict rules, 3 syllables, 7 syllables, 3 syllables, or 5, 7, 5. People are breaking the form slightly, but it is a form of micro poetry. So we'll be talking about all these things, but I just love what you said there about your friends, playing a haiku game. It's absolutely, you weren't kidding when you said you were word nerds. No, poetry nerds, which is absolutely fantastic. And yeah, I think people can be a bit afraid of poetry. So when we're, in our teens and emotion is just overflowing, we find ourselves spontaneously writing poetry. And then we stop. And we're almost ashamed of it, and we definitely don't want to put it out there. And that was the way it was anyway. Now people are putting it out there, and they're rediscovering that love of poetry. And I would really say that every author should be writing poems behind the scenes. It's a great way to practice your word craft. Poetry forces you to really think about word choice, about form, about... it just improves your craft as a writer to attempt to write poetry, even if you were to never publish those poems. We have Joyce, who's here from Tramore in Ireland. I know it very well. I was born in Waterford, Joyce. And she says, this is very exciting, meaning the Self-Publishing Poetry Podcast. I have lots of poems written throughout the year and would love to self-publish a selection of poems. So I think that's what we're actually going to talk about next month, is we will just talk about the simple act of putting together what's called a poetry chapbook, which is very short. My first one that I did was just 10 poems. And if you haven't self-published at all before, it's a great way to start, because again, it makes you think about interior design, the layout of the words on the page, headings and so on. All of these things get done, but in a very short form. So it makes it kind of comfortable. And in fact, I've gone on to do that repeatedly. When I write 10 that I'm happy to put out into the world, I just put a book of 10 together. And so it's poetry 1, poetry 2, 3, 4, and then gather a number of them together into themed collections that are longer and more costly. And you can sell those chapbooks very cheaply, and people really like them. So we might talk about that in more detail next time out. Yeah.
And I love what you mentioned, that in chapbooks, one of the things, and I think right now that's also a very important issue, that next to your poetry, if you have design skills, or if you have illustration skill, or any kind of drawings, or a collaboration with someone who is a great illustrator, that goes really hand in hand with writing. So I would definitely, I would think that we will talk about this at large, or multiple times during our podcast that collaborating with someone or just exploring your artistic streak, your drawings, that's definitely addition to your words.
Absolutely. I think you really can get creative with poetry books. Photography is another thing. On Instagram, at Orna Ross, for any of you Insta people out there, please do follow and I'll follow back. What I do is take a picture and then write a poem underneath it, or do a haiku around the picture. And I find that interspersed with little kind of quotes for poets, quotes for creatives. Yeah. I find that really interesting. And I would love eventually to actually do a high quality book that would both the poetry and the photos together would be a really kind of nice thing to do. But it definitely, you can get loose with this form. You can really let your creativity run wild here, perhaps more than you can in a non-fiction or fiction environment, perhaps. And it can also loosen your creativity for other writing, without a doubt.
Definitely, the context shifts when you bring in the visual as well as the audio that is really a poem. I mean, what you mentioned before, that if you are a writer, any type of writer, you should explore the practical side of how you create a poem, because you make word choices much more consciously when you are trying to fit into a form. And if you bring in the visual as well, then that's a whole other type of creative practice. So I think, and especially now that there are a lot of different, aside from Instagram, there are a lot of different platforms that are actually about exploring how you can put together text and picture or photos or drawings or any type of visual aid. You should experiment with that.
Definitely, and we will be talking lots about that. And the other thing that's going to be unique to this podcast is that we are inviting poets to submit to the podcast. So if you want to know more about this particular aspect, each podcast on a Wednesday. So we will be here on Facebook Live on the last Monday of every month at this time from September onwards. So that in this segment, we'll be doing the advice stuff, talking about how to publish the poems, how to put the books together, the themes, the formats, all the stuff that we were talking about just there. But then we are also inviting you to submit an audio poem or two or three, your best work essentially, or your favorite poems, to record yourself reading or performing your poetry and to send it through to us. And we will choose each month some poets to feature their work. And we also invite you to send in, the background, the history to the poem, and more about you and your own history as a poet. When did you start writing poetry? What do you love? What tradition are you in? Who are the comparable poets to you? Really important, an important thing for you to know and understand as you publish your work, so that you can put it out there in a way that you can market it with the also boughts and the comparable poets. So yeah, that's going to be a unique feature. And then we're also, as well as having that poetry spilling over in the podcast, Dalma is going to do an interview each month with a featured poet. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm setting out to interview, do 10 or 15-minute interviews with poets who are the most inspirational right now, or who are trending right now, and what are their inspirations, what are their influencers, basically who influenced them to go into this particular genre, what are the tricks and tips that they can give young poets or just starting out poets out there? Who are their readers? So basically everything that they can tell about their craft. So this is what I'm going to be looking out for. So I hope to give you the best poets out there, or the most inspirational poets out there.
Fantastic. So that's it, folks. That's what you can look forward to. Those three kinds of aspects: the advice about how to do it, the featured poets who are doing it in an inspirational sort of way, so you can learn from them and their craft, their techniques, and their publishing methods. And our Indie Poetry Please, where we actually bring poetry to you and bring your poetry to the listening world. So if you'd like to submit to that part of the show, the Indie Poetry Please, it's ornaross.com/poetry podcast. You'll find everything you need to know what to do there. So we expect to get quite a few submissions, and we will be choosing poetry based on all sorts of different reasons, but if you keep submitting, I'm pretty sure that we'll be able to find a space for you at some point over the coming weeks and months. And I am really looking forward to this podcast and watching how it develops over the months, because it is very much going to be about you guys and what you need and want, feeding back to us so that we know what to bring you, because this is, I think, just the start. I think we really are going to experience an enormous renaissance in poetry, and that really excites and delights me. So.
Definitely me too. I mean, just for the last 2 months when we started to talk about this, I never actually thought in my life that I'm going to speak about poetry and people are going to be listening into it. So I'm just very excited to be part of this. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
It's fantastic to have you here, Dalma. You are the person to do it. There's no doubt about that. Of course, we will see you on the last Monday of next month, September. And do submit your poems if you'd like us to include it. It's ornaross.com/poetry podcast. And if you have any questions or comments, suggestions, leave them here in the comment box on Facebook Live, and we will be reading that and taking them up. So thank you, Dalma, so much. And thank you, everybody. May your lives be full of poetry between now and the next time we see you.
Thank you so much, Orna. And bye, guys. I will look forward to getting to know more of you.
See you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.